Hello, welcome to the first part of the video lesson on Introduction to Feminist Criticism. In this video, we will look very briefly at the definition of feminism and feminist criticism and then move on to a brief history of feminism. The history of feminism has often been divided into three waves. So, in this video, we will look at the first wave of feminism, and in the coming videos, we will look at the second and third wave. So, let's begin with a simple working definition of feminism and feminist criticism. A broad definition of feminism would be that it refers to the belief in the equality of the sexes and in the redressal of historic injustices that women over the world have been suffering on account of patriarchy. So, there is a general idea that feminism is against men or that feminism is about the superiority of women, but none of that is actually true because feminism refers to the belief in the equality of the sexes, man and woman, and any other sexual identity. All people are equal. That is the basis of the ideology that we call feminism. Feminism also believes that historically women have been suffering several kinds of injustices because of patriarchy. And these injustices have to be redressed. These injustices have to be overcome. So, feminism not just believes that men, women, and all other transsexuals, transgenders, everyone is equal in a very broad sense. It is a belief in equality across the sexes, across genders, but it also believes that inequality has been historically created and injustices have been historically imposed on women and some other marginalized genders like transgenders and transsexuals. And these kind of inequalities and these kinds of injustices have to be overcome through political action, have to be overcome by questioning patriarchy. Now, what is patriarchy? Literally, patriarchy means the rule of the father. But what it actually means is that society is structured in such a way that the rules and laws underlying society favor men over women. Because historically, many of these rules have been created by men, they tend to favor men over women. So, patriarchy is not just about one specific kind of law or a rule or something like that, but the idea that every aspect of society, whether it is the space of employment, whether it is the space of the family, whether it is the domain of sexuality or the domain of work or any other domain, all these domains are structured by patriarchy, and therefore they have always historically favored men over women. Feminist literary criticism is derived from feminism as a movement, but feminist literary criticism examines the ways in which literature and other cultural productions like cinema, art, etc. reinforces or undermines the economic, political, social, and psychological oppression of women. So, this is what feminist literary criticism is interested in. Feminism has shown us that women have been historically oppressed in so many ways economically, politically, socially, psychologically, etc. So, feminist literary criticism examines and analyzes literary texts and other cultural texts to see whether those texts reinforce this oppression of women, whether those texts add to the oppression of women, or whether those texts undermine this oppression of women, whether those texts criticize this oppression of women. So what does any literary text or filmic text or other cultural text do? What is its attitude towards this oppression that women are facing? That is a question posed by feminist literary criticism. Now, what do feminist critics do? This is a question that is asked and answered by Peter Barry in his book Beginning Theory. So he has a section on feminist literary criticism where he lists some 11 activities as the key activities in feminist criticism. He asks the question, what do feminists do or what do feminist critics do? And these are the answers. First of all, feminist critics rethink the canon, aiming at the rediscovery of texts written by women. So you know that there is something called the literary canon, which again is mostly patriarchal. It is mostly produced by men. Which kind of text fit into the canon is decided by men, and therefore many of the great writers that we think about are people like, for example, Chaucer, Shakespeare, Milton, etc., up to the contemporary age. When we think of the greatest writers in English literary canon, we always think of men. So feminist critics say that we should rethink the very concept of this canon and we should rediscover texts that were written by women. It is not because women were not good enough writers, but because the canon was determined by men that these women writers were unable to find a place in that canon. So very few women writers have found a place in that canon. So we should rediscover more women writers and more writings, more texts by these women writers and try to create an alternative canon. The second point is to revalue women's experience. So again, historically, it is always men's experience that has been valued because men were allowed to go out into the public and women were not given those kind of rights and freedoms, because of which people thought that women's experience was limited. They thought that men's experience was much more vast. They would go out to the public and they knew about current events, they knew about political incidents, they knew about international events, etc. Whereas women only knew about things within the family. This was the traditional idea about women's experience, and therefore women's experience was devalued. It was not given any value. Now, feminist literary critics say that we should revalue women's experience. We should bring value back to women's experience and say that women have a rich inner world. They have a rich experience of the world. It doesn't matter how many places they have been to. It is all about what they have learned from that experience, and women's experience is also considered a kind of collective experience, that women talk to each other, they share their experiences and they form a certain kind of collective experience. So the value of this experience of women is foregrounded by feminist critics. Third, feminist critics examine representations of women in literature by men and women. So you take literary texts written by both men and women, and then you examine how are women represented in these literary texts. Fourth, feminist critics challenge representations of women as other, as lack, as part of nature. So this fourth point proceeds from the third point. Once you look at how women are represented in literature, both by men and by women, then you challenge certain kinds of representations of women. You question certain kinds of representations of women. What does this mean, to represent women as other? There is an idea of self versus other. Self, the idea of yourself. So, but self doesn't mean just yourself, just that one person. Self refers to how we think about life worlds and experiences that are very similar to ours. So, when we say self, we think not just of ourselves, but also of all the people who share certain things with us. people who share our gender, people who share our nationality, our language, our religion, our caste or class or race and other things like that. All the people whom we consider similar to us in these many respects, we consider self, and all those who are different from us, we consider them as other. So those belonging to another opposite sex, those belonging to another religion or culture or nation or caste, we consider them all as other. So those representations, whether it is by men or women, which look at women as other, as something else, which basically means representations which are patriarchal in nature, representations which are from the perspectives of men, those kind of representations have to be challenged by feminist criticism. Fifth, examine power relations which obtain in texts and in life with a view to breaking them down, seeing reading as a political act and showing the extent of patriarchy. So here, what another thing that feminist critics do after reading these texts is to examine what kind of power relations can we see in these texts and what do they tell us about power relations in life, in reality around us. And you don't just say this is the power relation, but you also break down that power relation. You try to analyze that power relation to find out how was this power relation formed and how can we destroy or invert or subvert that power relation. How can we change that power relation so as to give more power to the powerless? And this kind of a reading, this kind of criticism sees reading as a political act. And it is by analyzing such power relations that we can see what is the extent of patriarchy that is entrenched in that particular text and also in our life around us. Sixth point, feminist critics recognize the role of language in making what is social and constructed seem transparent and natural. Now, construction, social construction is a very important term for feminist critics because they say that gender roles have been socially constructed. So, in the previous introduction that I gave to the concept of gender, you would have noticed that gender is different from the idea of sex, which is a biological category, because gender is a socially constructed category, which means that society decides which traits belong to which gender. So now what language does in these literary texts is also that it hides the fact that certain kinds of differences are socially constructed. Rather, language makes it seem as if those differences, for example, differences between men and women. In the previous video, we talked about stereotypes like boys don't cry, right? Whereas actually both men and women can cry. There is no biological aspect that forbids or that prevents men from crying. But this is a gendered stereotype existing in society and it is socially constructed. But if you have several works, several texts that reinforce this idea that boys don't cry and it is girls who cry, etc., then language is actually what language is doing in those texts is making those kind of social constructions of gendered identities seem very natural. So something that is socially constructed is presented as natural through the use of language. Seventh, feminist critics raise a question of whether men and women are essentially different because of biology or are socially constructed as different. So again, this is related to what we have already discussed in the introduction to gender. So feminist critics also ask this question: how far is there any essential difference between men and women because of biology? Or is it just that they are completely socially constructed as different? If there are any such essential differences, how far do they matter? What are their consequences, etc.? Eighth point, Feminist criticism explores the question of whether there is a female language, an écriture feminine, and whether this is also available to men. So once you question the kind of patriarchal role that language plays in making what is socially constructed seem natural in literary texts, then you have to think about an alternative form of language. Is there an alternative language? Is there a non-patriarchal language which could be called a female language, which will allow you to write in a non-patriarchal way, which will defamiliarize us from those things that seem natural and foreground the socially constructed nature of gender? Is there such a possibility for a new kind of language which we can call écriture féminine, which is a term introduced by the French feminist Hélène Cixous? We will discuss this in more detail in the next video when we talk about second wave feminism. But this is a question. What kind of language could become a female language, and is it something that only women can use, or is it also available to men? A non-patriarchal way of representing, a non-patriarchal way of writing, is that possible for men as well? The ninth point, feminist critics reread psychoanalysis to further explore the issue of female and male identity. So you would be familiar with psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic criticism that is derives from the ideas of Sigmund Freud, Jacques Lacan, etc. So feminist critics consider whether psychoanalysis is also patriarchal in nature, or is there any possibility to either reread psychoanalytic theory or to create a new kind of psychoanalytic theory in order to explore the issue of male identity versus female identity. So psychoanalysis looks at how identity is formed, the ego, our identity, how is our consciousness formed? That is something that psychoanalysis looks at. But traditional psychoanalysis, Freudian psychoanalysis, is completely based on, it is centered on male identity and male consciousness. So is there a possibility of also using psychoanalysis to understand female identity and female consciousness? The 10th point, feminist critics question the popular notion of the death of the author, asking whether there are only subject positions constructed in discourse, or whether, on the contrary, the experience, that is of a black or lesbian writer, is central. So the death of the author is a very important notion in post-structural literary theory. It was proposed by the theorist Roland Barthes, and Barthes said that the author, as somebody who approaches a text with intention, with purpose, and the text is then the fulfillment of the author's intention, that idea of the author no longer exists. And Barthes says that rather the author is just a space, it's just a subject position that somebody occupies, and the text constructs itself through discourse. The text constructs itself through passing through this vessel called the author. So the author is just a vessel and a catalyst, and the text creates itself. That is a post-structuralist idea of the concept of the author. But some feminist critics also question this idea of the death of the author, because if there is the death of the author, then the author's identity and experience are unimportant. But what if the author is a woman? What if the author is a lesbian? What if the author is a black woman or a Dalit woman or a Muslim woman whose personal experiences are extremely important to her text? Then can we still talk so simply about the death of the author? And the 11th point, feminist critics make clear the ideological base of supposedly neutral or mainstream literary interpretations. So it is not just literary texts that they question to discover the ideology of patriarchy within them, but even literary interpretations, literary theories and literary interpretations, literary criticisms that we see. There are the feminist critics approach those interpretations also with the same question of whether they are structured by a patriarchal ideology. So these are the main points that Peter Barry mentions in his book Beginning Theory in the section on feminist literary criticism as the key activities in feminist criticism. Now we will move towards a history of feminism in general. So as I mentioned, there are three waves, as we understand, of feminism. But even before that, there are some early beginnings that we associate with feminism, feminist theory, the feminist movement, etc. So the feminist theory that exists today is based on women's rights movements that arose in Europe and America during the 1960s. But there are some longer antecedents. There is a longer past to feminist theory. So the ideas behind feminist theory or the inspiration behind feminist theory or the feminist movement goes as far back as the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, and later the abolitionist movement in the United States. So Enlightenment was that moment when reason was portrayed as the most important aspect of human existence, and all human beings were considered to be equal. So, however, even the ideals of the Enlightenment did not at that time include women, slaves, and so many other people. But still, those ideas that it is possible to think of everybody as sharing something within them, some spark of reason or something which makes them all equal at a fundamental level. That is something that has inspired the feminist movement. The French Revolution again came with the idea of equality of classes. The proletariats, the French peasants rose up in arms in a violent struggle against the aristocracy, against the monarchy and the aristocracy, which was a way of questioning the divine right of kingship and the belief that existed in society until then, that the upper classes would always remain in their positions of privilege, whereas the lower classes, the working classes, were forced to remain in their own subservient positions. So this was questioned by the French Revolution, which inspired many women to also think about, if there can be equality between classes, then why not equality between genders? And then later, the abolitionist movement, the abolition of slavery, that was a major movement that came up, especially in the United States. And that also led many women supporters of abolition. There were many women who supported the abolition of slavery. They opposed slavery. They wanted to support its abolition. So they also started slowly campaigning for their own rights. Because when you say that black people are equal to white people, slowly that rhetoric also makes you think that then why can't we say that women are equal to men? So all these different movements have inspired or influenced feminism as a movement in many different ways. One of the most important early texts of feminism is A Vindication of the Rights of Women by Mary Wollstonecraft, which was published in 1792. And Mary Wollstonecraft was an English woman who had a very interesting life, and she was married to a philosopher named William Godwin. And her daughter Mary, she also had a daughter named Mary, Mary Godwin, and Mary Godwin married the romantic poet P.B. Shelley and came to be known as Mary Shelley, and she is the author of the famous Victorian horror novel Frankenstein. So Mary Wollstonecraft is the mother of that Mary Shelley. Anyway, Mary Wollstonecraft is a very important figure, an early figure who would not have perhaps identified herself as a feminist because that term did not exist at that time in exactly the same way, but she talked about the importance of giving education to women and the importance of the rights of women. She said that women should be treated as rational people just like men. So, equality of men and women was very important to Mary Wollstonecraft. There were also some early male writers, important writers and philosophers who supported equality for women, including John Stuart Mill, who wrote the book The Subjection of Woman in 1969, and Friedrich Engels, who wrote The Origin of the Family in 1884. Friedrich Engels, as many of you know, is a Marxist, or rather, he's a communist thinker who worked with Karl Marx, and together they have written a lot of important works, including the Communist Manifesto, etc. So these are some of the early people who wrote about the importance of women's rights. Now we move on to the what we consider the official beginning of feminism, which is called first wave feminism. Uh, People say that first wave feminism comprises a period from 1830 to 1930. This is a rather arbitrary periodization, and different accounts of feminism might have slightly different periodization, but generally the 19th century and the early decades of the 20th century are considered to be the time of first wave feminism, and this was very popular in England and America. First wave feminism was involved mostly with getting legal and political rights for women, especially voting rights and property rights, as well as equal opportunities for education and employment. So at that time, women did not have any of these rights, and the first wave feminists were interested in trying to get these kind of rights for women. Again, within first wave feminism, there was initially a lot of women, and most of these were upper class or middle class women. They tried to get these kind of rights through petitioning the men who were in powerful positions in the government. Many men also supported them. However, later they took to increasingly violent methods like strike, processions, strikes, even violence against the police and things like that. And many of them in later years were part of what is called the suffragette movement. Suffragette movements means a movement for women's suffrage. Suffrage means voting rights. Suffrage, SUFFRAGE. Suffrage, voting rights. Women's suffrage, voting rights for women, and the suffragette movement is a term that is used to refer to this huge movement where women demanded voting rights for themselves. And some of the important people and groups that worked for women's voting rights were, first of all, in America, there was something called the Seneca Falls Convention in a place called Seneca Falls in New York. This was in 1848, and the women involved with that were Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucy Stone, Susan B. Anthony, etc. And here, Elizabeth Cady Stanton drafted a declaration called the Seneca Falls Declaration, which was based on the Declaration of Independence of America. So they were trying to come together and declare the rights that they wanted to claim, the rights that were denied to them. Around the same time in Britain, there was a group called Langhorne Place Group or Langhorne Place Circle in the 1850s. This group also worked for attaining women's rights to vote and to own property and many other things like that. Much later, in the early 1900s, the more violent phase of the suffragette movement came under the leadership of Emmeline Pankhurst. She and many other women, they protested outside British Parliament, and they took to the streets. They were arrested. They were beaten up, and they had to face a lot of torment by the police. And when they were in jail, they went on hunger strike and they were force fed, etc. So it was almost like an independent struggle, but it was by women, the women of Britain, against the government and all the men in power who refused to give them voting rights. And this movement actually succeeded in the early 20th century. In Britain, there were some laws that were passed in 1918 and 1928 that gave voting rights to women. Initially, only married women over the age of 30 were given voting rights, but later the law was amended to include all women above the age of 21. In US as well, different states in the United States passed resolutions to allow women to vote. So the history of winning the right to vote in the United States is a bit more different because the different states in US have different laws. Now, the most important writer and critic who is associated with first wave feminism is Virginia Woolf. She's an English writer, and one of her most famous books is called A Room of One's Own, which was published in 1929. In this book, Woolf questions the patriarchal education systems and literary practices. And she says that women are forced to live a life that is not conducive to their emotional fulfillment. They are forced by stereotypes, gendered stereotypes in societies, and by patriarchal institutions. They are forced to live as wives, mothers, etc., and they are told to find fulfillment in those roles, but they are unable to find such fulfillment. And Woolf says in this book, very importantly, that women need money and a room of one's own in order to be able to write independently. So if you want to be a woman writer, if you just stay at home and you are in the midst of everything and you have all your duties, family duties, and you are also dependent on your husband or your father or somebody for money, then you will not be able to write properly. Rather, you should have an income of your own, you should have money of your own, and you should at least have a room of your own. It doesn't matter if you're married, you have children, or however many people are there. You should have a room of your own, a space of your own where you can sit and write. And here she's talking both about a physical room and also about having a certain space for yourself, a private space for yourself where you can be alone with your thoughts and then be able to put them down. She also says that language is patriarchal in nature, and therefore women writers are forced to express themselves in an idiom that could not capture their experience. So she also suggests looking at the language used by different writers. So in one of her essays, she talks about how she categorizes different writers and says that if you analyze their language, you can see that their language itself is gendered. So she's looking at all male writers, but she's saying that Wordsworth writes in such a way that his language is masculine. Keats writes in such a way that his language is feminine. Shelley, she says, is sexless, and Shakespeare is androgynous. She doesn't really go deeply into what aspects of language, whether it is grammar, vocabulary, what actually makes it gendered. That she doesn't go into great detail, but she talks about how language itself can have a gender. So this is one of the early moments when feminist critic tries to struggle with this question of what do we do with language which is itself shaped by patriarchy. And in another essay called Shakespeare's Sister, she talks about an imaginary woman named Judith Shakespeare, who is an imaginary sister to William Shakespeare. He never had a sister named Judith, but she's imagining that suppose Shakespeare had a sister named Judith, and suppose she also ran away from home and wanted to become a playwright just like her brother, what are the problems that she would have had to face? And by doing this, she's trying to show that if women did not come up as great writers in those periods at the same time as Chaucer, Shakespeare, Milton, etc., it is not for lack of talent, but rather because there are so many social, political, economic factors that restrict women and do not allow them to fulfill their own abilities as a creative writer. Now, to conclude, some of the leading achievements of first wave feminism include securing educational, political, and property rights for women, the movement of women from being imprisoned within the domestic sphere to a freer movement into the public sphere, and a defiance of gender stereotypes that are shaped by patriarchal society. These are some of the leading achievements of first wave feminism. But at the same time, there were some shortcomings as well, and the first wave feminism was sharply criticized for these shortcomings. The main point was that first wave feminism was mostly concerned with issues that affected upper class white women from the first world. It was not concerned with the issues of lower class women, with black women or women from other colored races, or women from the third world. It was concerned mostly about women from Europe, America, and other such first world countries, and even within those countries, only the white upper class women's issues were part of this movement. And one of the people who criticized this movement for this particular reason was somebody named Sojourner Truth, a black woman who was a former slave. And one of her important speeches, she used to give these extemporaneous speeches. She would just go without any notes or anything and speak. So she was a very famous public speaker in the 1850s, and she was one of the first people who later criticized this movement with her speech, which I think some of you may have studied in general English or something. There is a speech called Ain't I a Woman? Ain't I a woman? Sorry, there is a spelling mistake here. I have written Ain't I a woman, but it is Ain't I a woman? And the critique by Sojourner Truth was actually that none of the issues raised by these first wave feminists, these white feminists, none of them related to the problems that she was facing, because problems of black women at that time were completely different, and the experience of black women was completely different. So when women, first wave feminists were talking about women's experience, women's equality, women's rights, etc., they were only thinking about white women's experiences, white women's rights and equality among white women. They were not ready to include black women also into their movement, to consider black women also to be equal with them, and to try to find out what are the completely different problems that were being faced by black women at that point of time. So this was a very important criticism against first wave feminism. So now in the next video lesson, we will continue this history of feminism and talk about the second wave of feminism. Thank you.